to separate ourselves from the conditioning of the collective and find our own individuality, which is a process, and a process which is ongoing and almost infinite, and essentially ultimately leads to that transcendent self. Then we have Neptune at the level of Neptune acting as a conditioning force. Neptune has probably one of the widest spans along the negative to positive, for lack of a better term, continuum. And at the negative pole, we find Neptune associated with illusion and therefore bondage to illusion, which is definitely a form, a very intense form of conditioning. Neptune is also associated with addiction and self-destruction. And addiction can be viewed as probably, like one of the most intense forms of conditioning. When you are addicted, you are thoroughly conditioned to pursuing the object of your addiction. And we think of addiction in terms of like things like heroin and alcohol, etc. But we can, if we think deeply about it, generalize and realize that we are addicted to many, many things that we consider quite benign and quite even necessary for our existence at this level of reality. In fact, we are addicted to this level of reality.
Case in point, a collective addiction of like for economic purposes with slavery.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. You can take that and like run with it all over the place. So in terms of the transcendent aspect of Neptune, that force which is drawing us out of our conditioning, two primary mechanisms. One is loosening our attachments. Neptune acts to loosen and dissolve our attachments away. And to the extent that attachment is a primary mechanism that enforces our conditioning, this allows us to rise above our conditioning. And the second is dissolving our ego identity. As we progress toward further dissolution of ego identity, it is the ego that is conditioned. And it is the ego that is a primary mechanism for holding on to our conditioning. Then we have Pluto. Okay, at the negative pole of Pluto's manifestation, Pluto is a very, very powerful energy, essentially an energy that is so powerful that it can enslave the soul. We become obsessed with power and domination, and this drives us to all sorts of conditioned behavior, behavior over which we often have no real control. An essential quality or need of the Pluto energy is the seeking of union. It's why the 8th house is associated with intimacy. It is that essential yearning of the psyche to return to its source. But so there's a powerful drive within the psyche to fill this void. And when not directed, for lack of a better word, properly, that void can be filled in all sorts of sub-optimizing ways, through, attraction to all kinds of obsessions. And here again, Pluto drags us into the web of conditioning. Pluto is also associated with intense attachment. And again, this becomes a mechanism for for being attached to our conditioning, to the objects of our conditioning. In its transformative mode, Pluto is the energy that breaks down the walls. It breaks down the old outmoded constructs. It breaks down those things that are inhibiting us and keeping us from our maximum potential, however we define that. In the process, and as part of the process, when the transformative energy of Pluto is being activated in our lives, we are very, very often dazed and confused. This is very powerful energy. The attachments that it's working on are very powerful, and we are often feel like we have the earth is like just cut out from under us, and we're in a place of like we don't know what is happening. This is separating us from our attachments, and it can be a very painful process, but yeah, a process that if we go through it and reach the other side, we can achieve greater freedom. Coming to the moon's nodes, we can view the moon's, and this is getting back to your observation about the similarities between the moon nodal axis and the ICMC axis. We can view the moon's nodes as an axis of liberation with respect to our psychological conditioning. The south node associated with our innate predispositions, and these are it's carrying the content of our past lives, or if we don't choose to accept the concept of reincarnation, our innate talents and our natural predispositions for various outlooks and types of behavior. So by looking at the south node, we can examine, one thing we can examine is our propensity to function as conditioned beings. This is sort of a nexus of all our conditioning coming together. The north node being our destiny point is where we can move towards liberation from the conditioning embodied in our south node. And it's not that we have to abandon everything that the south node stands for. It's not that we have to remove ourselves from all those predispositions and the innateness of our nature. We just have to realize that we don't have to be bound by it. We just have to realize that we don't have to let it be, we don't have to let it condition our psyche and our behavior. We can move towards our destiny node, and we can still, in fact, we can better actualize the content of the south node by doing so. However, there's also a danger of entrapment because, again, it depends on what we are moving towards. And this is, this is a choice that we are going to make. We can move towards a destiny that is truly going to bring us liberation, or we can move towards a destiny that we then become entangled in a new experience, in a new competency, but then we come back and that becomes our future south node experience. So finally, we have the ascendant. And the ascendant symbolizes it's how we integrate our psyche. It's how we take all of the various psychological components symbolized by all the other planets and points of the astrological chart and fit them together into hopefully a coherent psychological framework. So it's the integration, to the extent that the astrological symbol set represents our conditioning, then the ascendant represents the integration of all of these conditioning influences into our psyche, so that they operate as a coherent unit. So it's also where we can begin to sort of recognize those points of conditioning and maybe start constructing a psyche where we're integrating at a level that frees us, at least to a certain extent, from those conditioning influences and allows us to function as a more conscious being rather than a more conditioned being. Yeah.
Well, we've been talking about all of this conditioning and influence and stuff. Is this strictly natal chart, or is this can it progress? Because our ascendant would stay the same.
Yeah.
But our influences where this culminates and we process could change with the progression.
Yeah.
Where things are placed.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that you can certainly look at the progress chart in terms of how these planets represent the conditioning influences on our psyche, and how they may have developed and how they may have reached points where we can implement certain influences consciously to try to overcome the conditioning. Certainly with respect to transits of the outer planets, the transits of the outer planets certainly give us opportunities for, resonating and working with those transformational forces that the outer planets represent.
But how could a fixed point, the ascendant, represent all these life changes? I think that's kind of what I was, is that?
Well, no, I think I understand how, because if we're evolving as human beings, growing, developing, and our, natal chart, maybe, we process, we grow, we live, we learn, and I know, like, in here, I think most people who have an understanding of astrology are probably working to improve themselves. So I would think that the processes or the end result of the ascendant, like today, is not going to be the same as it was 5 years ago. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't grasp that last bit. It's the ascendant, right?
Well, I think it has to do with the concept that the meaning invested in let's say the sign of the ascendant is not something that's static. It's not something that is like, first of all, any of the astrological symbols can be seen as representing a vast continuum of meaning. There you can intuit an essential meaning to that symbol, but then amplify that essential meaning in many different directions, in many different potentialities, both on negative and positive dimensions, or whatever you want to call them, of that continuum. So you can take the ascendant and how you're integrating everything into your psyche, and as you develop that, for instance, take a Taurus ascendant, okay? At one level, okay, you're integrating everything in reference to your comfort and your your physical security,
And your values.
and well, because that's what you value. But then if you evolve, for lack of a better word, I realize that these terms have some judgmental implications, but I'm using them. You begin to examine your values, and you reconstruct your values so that your values now have a less materialistic nature. You're now integrating all this through a value system that is more spiritual, for lack of a better word, than material. And you're doing this and implementing the Taurian qualities. You're doing this in a very steadfast way. You're doing this with increasing amounts of devotion. So I think that's how this can be used.
I was really thankful you said the word integrate, because I think that's key. And it, to translate in a Taurian language, to integrate the tools, I think that Taurus perspective is the more solid, grounded sign for what you're talking about, because most of the other signs, there's going to be a lot more of that transformative. I can't pronounce. Taurus is that physical. So you're talking ascendant, rising sign, right? So when you look in the mirror, you get a physical image, and that would be the quick, blunt answer from the Taurus. But then as the other signs get into it, you'll start to obviously see it's not necessarily only fixed. There's movement, there's growth, there's change, there's perception, and intellect gets into it, and you realize, okay, well, the mirror juxtaposes things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then that can be that integration, or I wanted to bring in how your sun sign plays into with your ascendant, because for me, I have a Cancer rising and I'm a Sagittarius, and I had a hard time with that. And I finally realized it's teaching me to be broader minded and really appear as I want to appear, rather than getting hung up on the insecurity of stability or instability. Coming back down to Taurus, that stability, that security seems to be the only truth, and can be, but also can be challenged if there is that other truth. And I'm wanting to break it up, but also trying to be sensitive to the truth that it doesn't necessarily need to be broken up.
Right. Okay, I think
That
we are
word
out of
integration
time.
was
Integration.
the integration.
And, I do want to put in the shameless plug for my book, Depth Astrology, an astrological handbook in 4 volumes, Introduction, Planets and Signs, Planets and Houses, Planets and Aspects. So, and we have to vacate the room because
Thank you.
Thank you.
You make good points.
You did